The forest was silent except for the frantic pounding of a police K9 named Shadow, his nose cutting through the cold air as if chasing a ghost. Moments earlier, he had frozen, ears locked forward, body trembling, not from fear, but from recognizing a scent no one else noticed. Somewhere ahead, a child was in danger, and she had left a signal only a dog like him could understand. Now Shadow was ignoring every command, dragging his handler toward a hidden clearing no human had searched. What had the girl told him? Without a single word. And why was Shadow suddenly racing as if every second meant life or death? Shadow was more than a police dog. He was Officer Daniel Hale's closest companion, a German shepherd with sharp intelligence, quiet loyalty, and a calm confidence that made him trusted by every officer in the department. Daniel had raised him from a clumsy, oversized puppy into one of the most reliable K9s in the state, and their bond had long since crossed the line between partnership and family. Every morning, before the station filled with noise and urgency, Daniel and Shadow ran along the river trail, the dog's pace steady and rhythmic, his ears flicking back to make sure Daniel was always right behind him. At home, Shadow played gently with Daniel's 8-year-old daughter Emery, nudging her hands with patient affection and watching her with the soft, protective eyes only a dog can give a child. Emery loved him like a brother, and Shadow seemed to understand, shadowing her steps whenever she visited the station, always placing himself between her small frame and the world. It was during one of these slow, peaceful weeks that the first ripple of unease crept in. Autumn had just begun, painting the town in gold and rust, and Daniel had been noticing small, unsettling reports coming across the network. Vehicles seen idling near schools, strangers walking the wooded edges of neighborhoods, doors found open when families returned home. Each incident seemed minor on its own, easily explained, but together they cast a quiet shadow across the routine calm of the community. The department chalked it up to seasonal restlessness and increased foot traffic around the parks, yet Daniel couldn't ignore the way Shadow began behaving during their patrols. The usually composed shepherd would suddenly stop, ears pricked, gaze pinned toward the dense tree lines as though hearing a whisper too faint for human ears. Some nights he would jolt awake, pacing the hallway with his fur bristled and his breath short, staring at the windows like he sensed something moving outside. Daniel tried to dismiss his concerns, telling himself that dogs pick up on things humans overlook, wild animals, shifting winds, distant sounds. But the tension in Shadow's body was different, sharper, as if he were tracking something he couldn't yet identify. And the tighter Shadow became, the more unsettled Daniel felt in return. Even Emery noticed. "Shadow's acting weird," she whispered one evening as the dog followed her into the kitchen, his posture protective, alert. She laughed nervously and scratched his head, trying to shake off the feeling. But Shadow didn't relax. He never took his eyes off the back door. Days later, during a quiet afternoon at the station, the first spike of dread hit. A call came in, a missing child, a little girl, taken from the edge of a playground near the woods. The details were scattered and frantic: a van no one recognized, a witness who saw a flash of movement, a lost backpack found in the grass. As officers scrambled, Daniel looked down at Shadow, who was already staring toward the door, body coiled and ready. It was as if he'd been waiting for this moment, anticipating the shape of danger before anyone else could see it. When Daniel clipped on the leash, Shadow lunged forward with uncharacteristic urgency, pulling him toward the direction of the disappearance before they even reached the scene. Their cruiser sped through winding streets as the sun dipped low, stretching long shadows across the pavement. Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened while Shadow stood rigid in the back seat, nose pressed to the cracked open window, drawing in every scent the wind carried. The entire drive felt heavy with unspoken tension. A missing child was every officer's nightmare, but with Shadow's growing agitation, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something worse. At the playground, officers walked in tight patterns, searching for clues, calling the girl's name into the fading light. The swings moved in the breeze, lonely and still. Shadow sniffed the abandoned backpack, then the grass, then the air, his tail lowering, his muscles tightening. When he began pulling with unmistakable direction toward the forest path, the other officers followed without hesitation. But even as Daniel moved with purpose, something in Shadow's posture made his heart sink. The dog wasn't just tracking, he was on edge, as if the trail ahead carried not only the little girl's scent, but the presence of something dangerous and hidden. With each step deeper into the woods, The peaceful calm of Daniel and Shadow's daily life felt further away, fading into a memory overshadowed by a growing threat. The air itself seemed to shift, heavier, colder, as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. And as Shadow led them farther, Daniel realized that the odd behavior, the pacing, the midnight vigilance, it hadn't been restlessness. Shadow had sensed this long before anyone understood, long before the girl vanished. And the dread settling in Daniel's chest was the unmistakable feeling that whatever danger they were stepping toward had already been watching, already waiting, long before the first cry for help was ever made. Shadow pulled Daniel deeper into the trees, moving with a precision that came from instinct rather than training, his body low, his breathing controlled, every muscle prepared for whatever lay ahead. The forest thickened quickly, swallowing the last traces of sunlight until only fractured beams filtered through the branches. The air grew cool and damp, heavy with the scent of moss, overturned soil, and something sharper, fear, sweat, the desperate traces of a child who had been dragged through a place she never should have been. The officers behind Daniel moved carefully, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves, but Shadow's movements were faster, more urgent, as though the trail were growing fresher with every stride. Every few steps, his ears twitched toward sounds no human could hear, the distant snap of a twig, the faint rustle of something moving just out of sight, the whisper of danger lurking beyond the reach of flashlights. Daniel felt his heartbeat matching Shadow's quickening pace, and each breath he took echoed with the knowledge that time was slipping through their fingers. The deeper they traveled, the more the forest seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, a sudden gust of air that carried an unfamiliar scent, the uneasy sensation of being watched from somewhere high in the branches, the way the leaves stilled as if the trees were listening. Though the officers kept communication steady and calm, their voices felt small against the vast, silent expanse around them. Shadow paused suddenly, his front paw hovering mid-step, the fur along his spine rising in a slow, chilling wave. Daniel raised a hand for the officers to stop. The forest went completely quiet. Even the insects had stilled. Shadow inhaled deeply, eyes narrowing toward a cluster of fallen logs ahead, his tail stiff, his stance protective. A sharp metallic sound cracked through the silence. Not loud, but unmistakable. Something was ahead, something human. Daniel motioned for two officers to sweep the adjacent path, but Shadow refused to follow them. He stayed glued to the ground, nose to the earth, then suddenly veered off the trail entirely, dragging Daniel toward the left, where the brush grew thick and tangled. The trail they had been following wasn't the girl's main path. She had tried to escape. Shadow was following her attempts, her desperate zigzags through the underbrush, tracing every terrified turn she had made. And the realization hit with a sickening clarity: she had been running. But from who? From what? As the team followed Shadow's detour, the first true sign of struggle emerged. A torn scrap of bright yellow fabric snagged on a thorny branch. Daniel picked it up, his throat tightening. The missing girl had been wearing a yellow jacket. Shadow's ears pinned back as he let out a low, trembling growl, something he rarely did. It wasn't a warning, it was a statement. The danger was close, too close, and the girl had been here recently. Pushing forward, they found footprints, small, scattered, frantic. But alongside them were heavier boot prints, deep and deliberate, circling the area like the steps of a predator tightening its hold. One officer cursed under his breath. Another radioed the command center with an update. Yet as they examined the tracks, Shadow lifted his head abruptly, staring into the distance with an intensity that hollowed the air. Daniel had seen that look only twice in Shadow's career, both times moments before finding someone in serious danger. Shadow lunged again, no longer concerned with staying quiet. He tore through a curtain of vines and into a narrow ravine where the earth dipped into a winding gully. Daniel rushed after him, stumbling over exposed roots, branches whipping at his arms. The gully was darker than the forest above, shadowed by looming rock walls and thick clusters of overgrown brush. It felt like a place meant to hide secrets, a place danger could remain unseen. The scent of damp earth filled the air, and underneath it something cold and metallic. Fear. Shadow's paw prints etched into the soft soil ahead led toward a crooked wooden structure barely visible beneath moss and debris. It looked like an old hunting shed, abandoned decades ago, its door half rotted, its windows boarded. Daniel's gut twisted. Nothing good ever happened in places like this. Officers fanned out, guns raised, but Shadow moved differently, cautiously, silently, circling the structure's perimeter with slow, calculating steps. He lowered his head to the ground, sniffed near the base of the shed, then suddenly whipped his head upward, hackles shooting up, gaze fixed on the boarded window, as though he sensed movement behind it. Daniel approached the shed, but before he could signal the team, Shadow froze and let out a sharp, guttural bark that echoed through the ravine like an alarm. The kind of bark that meant danger now. Officers closed in. Daniel reached for the handle, but a sudden crash erupted from inside. Something heavy toppled. A muffled cry pierced through the wooden slats. The girl, she was inside, alive, but the sound that followed wasn't hers. Heavy footsteps, fast, closing in. Daniel's heart dropped. The kidnapper was still there. Shadow launched himself at the door just as it swung open from the inside, revealing a masked figure darting out with a flash of steel in hand. The officers shouted commands, but the suspect bolted toward the gully's exit. Shadow sprinted after him, his speed explosive, his focus absolute. Daniel yelled for backup, but his voice felt distant beneath the pounding of adrenaline. The masked man shoved through the brush, stumbling over rocks, but Shadow was faster, closing the distance with terrifying precision. Then the forest shifted again. A second figure appeared, not running, watching, staring down at Daniel from atop the ravine with eerie stillness, as if assessing the officers, the shed, the fleeing suspect. A silent accomplice. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, he vanished behind the ridge. Daniel's stomach twisted. They weren't chasing one kidnapper. They were dealing with more. Organized, coordinated, prepared. Shadow was nearly on the fleeing man when the ground suddenly gave way beneath the suspect's feet. He tumbled down a muddy slope, vanishing into a thicket of thorn bushes. Shadow skidded to a stop at the edge, barking furiously, refusing to jump blindly after him. Daniel reached Shadow seconds later, scanning the darkness below, but the suspect was gone. Completely gone. The forest swallowed him without a trace. Frustration surged, but Shadow wasn't focused on the escape. He sprinted back toward the shed, back to the cries inside, back to the girl they had almost reached. Daniel followed as fast as his shaking legs could carry him. The officers forced the shed door open fully now, light flooding the small, filthy interior. The girl was there, small, terrified, trembling so violently her knees buckled before an officer caught her. But as Daniel knelt beside her, he noticed her hands. She wasn't just shaking. She was gesturing, trying to form a shape with her fingers. A signal, something she wanted them to understand. Her breaths came fast and broken, her eyes fixed on Shadow as if the dog were the only safe thing in the world. Shadow stepped forward, lowering his head. The girl touched his fur with trembling fingertips, then moved her hand in a strange pattern. 4 taps against his shoulder. Pause, then 1 long press. Shadow stiffened. Daniel recognized that reaction instantly. It wasn't random. It wasn't a habit. It was a communication Shadow had been trained to recognize for emergencies when victims couldn't speak freely. But why would she know it? Why would a kidnapped girl signal a police K9 with a code meant for silent alerts? And more importantly, what was she warning Shadow about? Shadow reacted before anyone else, snapping his head toward the far end of the ravine as the girl's trembling fingers completed the silent code, his entire body locking into a rigid, defensive stance as if the earth itself had whispered a warning meant only for him. Daniel's blood ran cold. 4 taps and a long press meant imminent ambush, meant hidden danger still present, meant the kidnapper hadn't fled at all but had circled back, waiting for the moment the officers relaxed around the rescued child. As Daniel reached for his radio, a sharp crack echoed from the ridge above. Wood splintering, metal sliding, and then the second masked figure burst from the tree line with a feral speed, launching down the slope toward the officers with ruthless precision, forcing them to scatter as he barreled through them to reach the girl. His hands were empty, but the intent in his movement was worse than any weapon. He wasn't running to escape. He was running to reclaim her. Shadow's growl became a thunderous roar as he hurled himself forward, intercepting the man before he could close the last few feet, the impact knocking both bodies into the dirt in a violent blur of fur and limbs. The attacker fought like someone who had prepared for this exact moment, twisting and striking with brutal force, his movements sharp and inhumanly fast. But Shadow didn't relent, didn't hesitate, driving his weight into the man's chest and forcing him back with the full power of a trained K9 devoted to protecting the helpless. Daniel lunged toward them, shouting commands drowned out by the chaos, pulling an officer out of the path of a wild kick as the attacker reached for a concealed blade strapped to his boot. With a sudden, horrifying shift, the man used his free leg to slam Shadow off balance, sending the dog rolling across the ground before he surged upright again, charging once more without fear or pause. The girl screamed, her voice cracking in terror, as the masked man tore free from the scuffle and sprinted toward her, using the momentary gap to launch himself at her with outstretched arms, only to freeze mid-step as a rusted metal grate collapsed beneath his foot. The forest floor had been hiding a forgotten drainage shaft, and his leg plunged through the opening, trapping him violently at the knee. Shadow seized the opportunity, lunging with such precision that he latched onto the attacker's arm and forced him downward, pinning him in the dirt as officers swarmed in, weapons drawn, securing the man with sheer force and adrenaline, while Daniel scooped the girl into his arms. But the twist the girl had tried to warn them of was not finished. As the officers restrained the first captor, Shadow abruptly turned again, ears pinned, teeth bared, staring up toward the incline where the original kidnapper had vanished. Leaves shifted. A breath of movement whispered down the slope. Daniel's heart stuttered. There was a third, the mastermind, the one the girl had never seen directly but had heard moving in the dark. And he was close, too close. A flash of silver cut through the shadows, aimed straight at Daniel. Shadow sprinted with a speed that defied physics, slamming into Daniel with bone, rattling force that knocked him and the girl to the ground, just as the blade sliced through the air where Daniel's head had been. The third kidnapper roared in frustration and charged, but Shadow turned mid-fall, planting himself between his partner and the threat with a glare that could have frozen fire. The man lunged again, but Shadow launched higher than Daniel had ever seen him, catching the man's arm mid-strike, twisting his trajectory and dragging him down the slope in a tumble of leaves, dirt, and snapping branches that ended in a heavy crash at the ravine's base. Officers scrambled down after them, Daniel racing ahead with terror pounding through every vein, terrified of what he'd find when the dust settled. But when he reached the bottom, Shadow was standing, trembling blood streaking his fur, breath ragged, but victorious, his jaws still gripping the man's sleeve until officers secured the final kidnapper in handcuffs. The forest fell silent again, the danger collapsing in on itself like a dying storm, and as Daniel knelt beside Shadow, pressing his forehead to the dog's, he felt the weight of everything they had survived settle deep in his chest. Shadow had sensed it all, the trap, the ambush, the hidden threat, and had done what no human could have done in time. He had saved a child. He had saved his handler. He had saved everyone, and as Daniel wrapped his arms around the trembling shepherd, the girl whispered the only truth any of them needed. Shadow didn't just change everything. He stopped something far worse than they ever imagined. The forest slowly exhaled the breath it had been holding, the way a storm finally releases its last echo long after the thunder has faded. And in that fragile quiet the world seemed to shrink down to three things: Daniel, Shadow, and the terrified little girl who clung to Shadow's fur as if he were the only solid thing left on earth. Officers moved through the ravine with swift, practiced motions, securing the captured men, calling for medics, marking evidence, illuminating the shadows with harsh beams of white light. Yet none of that felt real to Daniel. What felt real was the warmth of Shadow's trembling body pressed against his leg, the way the girl's small hands shook as they clutched the dog's coat, and the realization, heavy, overwhelming, that they had narrowly escaped something unimaginably dark. When medics reached them, they insisted on checking the girl first. She cried silently as they examined her, flinching at every touch, but Shadow never moved from her side. Even bleeding, exhausted, barely able to hold himself upright, he leaned his head against her arm in a gesture so gentle it softened the entire scene. Only after she finally nodded, reassured by his presence, did she allow herself to be lifted onto a stretcher. Yet even then her hand stayed tangled in Shadow's fur until the very last second, her grip loosening only when the stretcher began to move. Daniel watched her go, his heart cracking under the weight of everything she had endured, and a quiet vow formed inside him that she would never face danger alone again. Not if he or Shadow could prevent it. When the medics turned to Shadow, Daniel's breath caught in his chest. The dog stood as if nothing would bring him down, but up close the truth revealed itself. Deep scratches along his ribs, a puncture wound near his shoulder, blood matting his fur, his legs shaking from adrenaline fading into exhaustion. Daniel knelt, placing both hands on either side of Shadow's face, lifting his gaze until their eyes locked. The dog leaned forward, pressing his forehead to Daniel's with a slow, tired exhale that felt like a confession he had given everything, more than a dog should ever have to give. Daniel whispered quiet words meant only for Shadow, apologies and gratitude and promises tangled together. And the shepherd closed his eyes, accepting the touch like a tired warrior returning home from battle. When the medics tried to lift him onto a stretcher, Shadow resisted at first, not snarling, not aggressive, just unwilling to be taken from Daniel. He strained against the straps, his eyes never leaving his handler. Daniel placed a steady hand on his back and promised he would stay beside him the entire way. Only then did Shadow finally relent, lowering his head and allowing himself to be carried. The ambulance ride was a blur of flashing lights and whispered reassurances. Shadow lay weak but alert, his gaze following every movement Daniel made as though afraid to lose sight of him even for a moment. Daniel never let go of him, his hand resting on Shadow's side as gentle as a heartbeat. The little girl rode in a separate vehicle, escorted by officers and medics, and though Daniel couldn't see her, he imagined her small fingers still forming that silent code, the one that had saved them all. At the hospital, chaos erupted around them. Staff rushing, doors swinging, machines humming, but Shadow remained calm, watching Daniel with quiet trust. He endured the cleaning of his wounds with stoic patience, wincing only once when stitches pierced tender skin. Daniel felt each wince like a knife. The veterinarians worked methodically, praising Shadow in soft voices, marveling at his resilience. And when they finally stepped back with nods of approval, Daniel felt some of the crushing tension inside him loosen. Shadow would heal. It would take rest, medication, time, but he would heal. And as long as Shadow healed, Daniel could endure anything. In the days that followed, the story spread through the town like wildfire. People visited the station with flowers, cards, stuffed animals for the rescued girl, and treats for Shadow. News crews camped outside the hospital. Officers worked tirelessly to uncover the rest of the criminal network behind the kidnapping attempt, following the trail of evidence left in the woods. The girl's family visited Shadow often, their gratitude so fiercely emotional it brought Daniel to the edge of tears more than once. The girl, whose voice had returned in soft, fragile whispers, would sit beside Shadow, resting her head against his neck, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of his breathing. She had nightmares, of course, visions of masked faces, dark sheds, hands grabbing in the night, but Shadow always sensed when she trembled. Even injured, even stitched and sore, he would lift his head to rest it in her lap, grounding her with the warmth of his presence. Daniel found his own healing in quiet moments with Shadow. Late nights in the hospital room, when the halls were empty and the world finally felt still, he would sit beside Shadow's bed, replaying the events over and over, the blade that had nearly taken his life, the masked figure collapsing into the ravine, the girl's tiny hands forming a signal only Shadow understood. The moment Shadow threw himself between Daniel and death without hesitation. Every time he replayed it, he found the same truth waiting at the end. Shadow had not simply saved a life that night. He had saved a father, a family, a community. He had prevented something far darker from unfolding, and he had done it because of loyalty, because of love. Weeks later, when Shadow was finally cleared to return home, the department organized a small gathering at the station. Not a ceremony. Shadow didn't care for crowds, but a quiet celebration among those who knew him best. Officers lined the hallway as Daniel walked Shadow in, his steps slow but steady, his tail lifting just slightly at the familiar sense of home. Applause rippled through the building, gentle enough not to startle him but full of heartfelt admiration. The police chief knelt to place a small medal on Shadow's collar, a simple token engraved with the words "unmatched bravery." Shadow sniffed it once, then looked to Daniel, uninterested in medal but deeply attuned to the pride radiating from his partner. The rescued girl arrived with her parents shortly after. She ran to Shadow without hesitation, wrapping her arms around his neck with a fierce, childlike devotion that made half the room fall silent. Her father wiped tears from his cheeks. Her mother placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, unable to speak, and Shadow, still healing, still tired, pressed his muzzle gently to the girl's cheek, exhaling a soft breath as if telling her she was safe now, truly safe. In the months that followed, life slowly found its way back to normal. Daniel and Shadow returned to their morning river runs, though at a slower pace at first. Emery resumed playing with Shadow in the yard, her laughter filling the house with a sense of light that had dimmed during the ordeal. Daniel found himself watching Shadow more often, memorizing the rise and fall of his chest, the calm strength in his eyes, the easy way he seemed to sense when hearts were heavy. Shadow had always been loyal, but now his presence carried a deeper resonance, A reminder of lives saved, of instincts trusted, of a bond forged through fire. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the river gold, Daniel stopped their run halfway and knelt beside Shadow, who turned to him with quiet curiosity. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath the fur. Everything they had endured washed over him again, not with fear this time, but with gratitude so profound it rooted him to the earth. Shadow gazed up at him, ears relaxed, eyes warm, the embodiment of unwavering devotion. Daniel whispered a soft thank you, not just for the night in the woods, but for every moment before and after 6, for the loyalty that asked for nothing, for the courage that never wavered, for the love that had saved more than one life. Shadow leaned into him, closing his eyes, accepting the gratitude with silent dignity. And as the last light of day shimmered on the river, Daniel understood the truth he would carry for the rest of his life. A dog's heroism isn't measured by medals or headlines or the danger he overcomes, but by the depth of his loyalty, the kind that runs so deep it can sense fear before it's spoken, protection before it's needed, and love even in the darkest moments. Because some heroes don't wear badges. They walk on 4 paws, standing guard over the hearts that would break without them.